Welcome, sales professionals, to List and Sell, Sales Trainers List and Sell Online. This is where we start to examine certain aspects of the sales profession and give you, as best we can, an alternative point of view and arm you up when you're out there in the field. Today's subject matter is one that's very close to me because it's one that I've managed to handle very successfully for 30 years. It might sound funny to some of you, especially if you're a little bit apprehensive around the subject of price, of pricing of properties, of dealing with price, of dealing with sale prices and the whole lot. To my mind, I had many things that I was accused of as a real estate salesperson, not least of which was overpricing property. My competition used to say to me all the time or say about me, I should say, that you buy listings, that term meaning that you overestimated the price of a property in order to win the favor of a seller. And it always culminated into a stage where many times I would have sellers that I'd only met through the fact that my competition were promoting me by saying, watch out for him because this is what he does. Apparently, what he does is he puts your property on the market at a really high price, and then he gets you to adjust that down to a point where you actually sell it. And people would call me out to see this, and then they would also say at the same time, his fee is really high, not like other real estate agents, he's unrealistic and all this sort of stuff. They're actually doing me a favor, yeah? So what I try to get across to real estate salespeople, anyone that I'm actually have in my coaching realm or anyone that I have that I'm running from a mentor point of view, is to understand how pricing works. And for immediately, the first thing that comes to mind, and if you jump onto listandsell.com.au, even if you're not a member, and just go into the top end under Sales Trainer, you'll see a freebie section, and there's some dialogue there where I explain the difference between comparative value versus market value. I find that real estate agents have a preoccupation with the pricing game. And if we were to be perfectly honest, when we look at the pricing game, it is literally a guessing competition. And as you start to examine the price issue, you realize there's many good reasons for this. Let's just look at this. And if you're thinking for a second, if you're there going, oh, that's not me, I'm on top of this, I'm not preoccupied with price. Really? I mean, when you get back to your office having won a listing and you walk in, what's the first thing that your colleagues ask you if you mention that property you've just listed? Do they openly ask you about the property itself and focus on that without talking about its price? Do they talk about the seller's motive? Rarely. The first question they have is how much. I find this an eternal source of fascination. That, you come in as a salesperson, you've listed a property, you're talking to your colleagues about it. They might in fact be in touch with buyers, but all they want to know is how much it is. And if they then make a judgment around that price, they actually judge the quality of the listing based upon the price that the seller's looking to achieve. I find this absolutely ridiculous. You see, we are in the business of basically matching people to properties. I've said this and so many times it's ridiculous. We don't sell houses. We don't sell property. We don't sell the houses. I mean, the buyers, or we sell, the buyers buy homes. They buy them. We're not much more than a matching service. We need to match them up, and the rest happens almost magically. Have you ever found yourself walking down the driveway out of a listing and saying to yourself, you want to hang your head, you say, this is a heap of shit. I've just listed this at a price. I will struggle to get people to even talk to me about it, much less get them to come through the property, and I'm likely to never sell it at all because the buyer's expectation is too high. And you want to hang your head. You don't even want to tell the other salespeople in the office about this listing because of that. And miraculously, that property sale takes place not just near the asking price that you thought was overly inflated, at it, or sometimes even over it. And yeah, sometimes there's some vehicles that you need a helping hand from. Not again, it might be that there were two buyers on the property, or somebody else wanted it, or it went to auction and it just ran away with price. But irrespective of that, you've obviously had listings that you've thought that are no good, and they've turned out to be just fine and sold. Do we turn around and say, I'm just in an incredulous manner, that's it, I give up on the pricing equation? No, we walk around, give ourselves a nice little pat on the back and say, look what I did. Look how I managed to sell the property at that price, and we want all the kudos that goes with it. Similarly, have you actually had properties where you've walked down the driveway having listed it, and you want to jump in the air and click your heels because you're thinking, this is just money in the bank. This property will walk out the door. 6 weeks later, even 6 months later, it's still there. You can't even get people to talk about it, much less have a look at it. So this is where we start to understand all of the components, the elements that make up price. Can I start by saying this, if you're listening to it, certainly if we're sitting here now, please understand the most important point I can make about price. It is subjective. Depending upon the perspective that you're looking at a property, depending upon its perspective, this will determine or have a large influence on where the price sits. You see, if a buyer falls in love, let's just look at it from different capacities, but if a buyer looks at a property, for every buyer, despite what agents say, despite what your competition says, despite what everyone seems to want to get their head around, the reality is every property is different to a buyer, and certainly what I refer to as the buyer being the one that sees the most value in something, and that buyer becomes very cooperative around the terms and conditions that an owner wants. Yeah, despite what agents say about price, they will take the market value of that property to a different level. And this is where we kick in and we talk about the difference between comparative value and market value. Understand this, market value, is what a seller receives. Yet I see agents cast aspersions around market value so often they've no place to do it. You cannot determine market value without taking a property to market until such time as it's been offered to the market, and there's a raft of variables that pertain to where that value will eventually augur in. Sometimes it is below what we think, comparatively speaking, and sometimes it is above. Yet this confusion is offered to property sellers so bloody often that we get a confusion between comparative value and market value. And even worse, we have this overbearing obsession with talking about the value of the property, and this seems to be something that we believe can be done in a calculated manner. Again, it's subjective. My opinion of value on a property will nearly always differ with that of the seller. Most sellers arrive at the value of their property in direct correlation to their motive. They sit at a value that they think they need to derive from the property, typically because of a motive that has either been imposed or they would like to fulfill. And we explain this when we say that active property sellers are researching the market ahead of selling. See, it starts with the motive, They then say, how much do we need to fulfill this motive? Then when they're doing their research out there in the marketplace, comparing their property to others, they compare it, but it's biased because in the back of their minds, they know how much they need. So they're trying to make their property worth a certain amount of money. So you as a real estate sales professional, you turn up to their property, you foolhardily take on the guise of a valuer, an authority on where the value might sit, and your advice conflicts with theirs, you've got a problem. You can lose or win a seller with your understanding of price and exactly how it works. So I look at this and I say there are value variables, that there are influences in and around the market value that affect the eventual outcome independent of comparative advice. So understand that comparative value is not much more than a benchmark. It's a history lesson. It is something that is based upon what has happened, but has very little to do with what is about to happen. And although I've given a lot of speculation around where the market is going or where it will go quite soon, and I'm absolutely certain it will move into a space where the market is oversupplied. There's going to be more property on the market than there are buyers for them. And again, at the moment, for some of you, that's just how on earth. At the moment, there seems to be a shortage rather than oversupply. Believe you me, we will get to a point of oversupply. But even when we do, despite what I'm going to share with you around price, there is still always an opening, for a property to sell well above what everyone thinks is reasonable, comparatively speaking, or even subjectively speaking. So the value variables that come into play, some of which you as an estate agent have absolutely no control over. Yet I find that real estate agents, for one reason or another, tend to take on the onus, the responsibility for those variables and how it affects the overall price. Understand this, you cannot exert any major influence over the value variables that are beyond your control. The first of those I would mention to you is supply and demand. You can't control supply and demand at all. You can't control the number of properties that are coming onto the market compared with the number of buyers that are out there. And even then, even if the supply and demand's fairly good, you can't control buyer sentiment. So if the general feel of buyers is that the market is likely to come down, there will be a degree of apprehension to parting with certain amounts of money if the forecast is that the market is likely to tank. This is evident, or has been evident, despite the fact that we've got economic issues in and around COVID. We've still seen buyer sentiment, because buyer confidence is so strong, where buyers are paying premiums for properties. Now, I can tell you, based on the economic forecast, if you look at this pragmatically, it's pretty scary what I'm seeing some buyers pay. Again, it's not my place to make judgments around that, because a long time ago, I decided to be a real estate salesperson. So I don't deal in the space of reality, especially when it comes to price. I deal in the space of what might be, which is basically possibility. So there's the first two things. You can't control supply and demand with any major, or can't exert any major influence. I guess you can say, of course, if you have a property you've got a number of buyers that are chasing it and it's very popular, well, you can to some degree, because you've only got one to sell. So that can be controlled to some degree, but generally speaking, you can't control the overall market supply and demand. And of course, if there's too many properties chasing too few buyers, there is going to be downward pressure on property values at market. The downward pressure is going to be at market, not in analysis, not burying your head in comparative market analysis. Like, I'm not saying you should regard a comparative market analysis, but I do believe you should be dismissive of it in terms of relying upon it. And this needs to be explained thoroughly to a property seller. Most property sellers incorrectly assume that all agents are the same and all agents understand pricing and how it works. And as a consequence of that, they make a poor assumption that every agent's going to achieve the same price for a property. And this is how then they start to look at fees, they start to look at ancillary charges, and then wrongly assume that they're going to work. The next one is fiscal policy. Now, it hasn't happened yet, but as the economy tightens, there will be significant alterations in and around fiscal policy. You know, borrowing ratios to equity ratios will most likely change. People's capacity to borrow money will most likely change. Interest rates drops and rises will positively or negatively affect property values. Competing property, haven't seen this for some time, but if you do get into an oversupply, there will be sellers that are more motivated than others that you have, and you can't control what the competition's doing that are listed with other agents if they are dropping their prices in order to catch buyers. Something we will talk about with a great deal of thoroughness in explaining this as the market goes forward. So they're the value variables that are beyond your control. You should not accept responsibility for their condition, but you should accept responsibility for their interpretation and the communication of those to property sellers, and indeed the way your mindset operates around buyers and what they might be seeing and doing. Now, the variables that can be controlled, and this is where you've got to make the decision. Am I resolved to jump into this guessing game where I am speculating on what a property will sell for at the risk of sometimes winning the favor of sellers and sometimes losing it? Yeah. But you've got to look at what is the professional capacity of a real estate salesperson. What is it that we can offer to sellers? Well, to my mind, this is where there are value variables that are within the realms of your control through your professional capacity. And you should seek to elevate that capacity to a level where you are not talking about how they influence them, where you are instead positioning yourself as the influencer of those variables. And that is, of course, marketing, negotiation, and communication. We can control the perception of a property when it goes to market. And if we can enhance that perception so that it becomes a reality for a buyer, this will positively affect the perceived value of the property. It will not only affect it, but it can become a reality. And so it is that market value can be leveraged beyond comparison. And this needs to be understood as well. Secondly, negotiation. Now, so often we hear real estate agents say, you know, they're great negotiators, but if you listen to their dialogue, they're allowing the influence of supply and demand, for argument's sake. They're allowing the influence or the sentiment of what the market might be dictating to influence their capacity. You see, to my mind, the whole idea is to understand that when people are buying a home, they fall for it emotionally. I've said this 1,000 times. You use the word feel in combination with the word home, and you keep asking buyers, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about the price? How do you feel about the location? Do you feel like you could make this your home? Do you feel at home here? And just keep pushing those two emotions. And what you can then do is allow them to feel their way home and hopefully wrench the maximum, or in some cases, a premium value from them. And finally, communication. it's how you are saying it. It's how you are communicating the product to the market. It is how you have in your mind the disposition. Is it favorable to the seller, or are you conceding the reality of the situation? Please understand this. Property owners don't need a valuer. They don't need someone to sit down and calculate the value or run comparisons and stop there. What they need is a marketer. A marketer leverages the value beyond comparison, or at the very least, protects that value. They mitigate any foreseeable concession by focusing on the upside of the value equation. You don't need a valuer, you need a marketer. And I say this over and over to sellers, you don't need a concession. Yeah, you need a negotiator. And I say this openly. When they start to bring up the discounting of fees, or they start to bring up the notion of marketing and the company paying for it rather than them investing in it, I just look at them and I say, hang on. You don't need a concession. You just need a good negotiator. You need to see a good negotiator. And I've got to tell you, if any other agent you're considering has embraced the idea of lowering their fee, they can't possibly be or have the capacity to be a good negotiator. If they can't, at the very least, position themselves value-wise based upon what they're going to do, how on earth are they going to be able to do that with your property? And you don't need to sit down and be reading all this analysis stuff. You just need a good communicator. You need someone to represent you in the best possible light. The way I used to say it was, you don't need a facilitator. You need a salesperson. And what a salesperson does is, we're not sitting around analyzing value. We are busy creating it. We're almost like magicians. We create value that wasn't there in the first place. Don't believe I know what I'm talking about? Well, look at this. Do you know how many times I've sat in a house at a kitchen bench or a dining table, run a negotiation demonstration with a seller? And part of that demonstration is for me to talk about and renegotiate the property that they're living in some time ago. And I asked them, can you remember how much you loved it? They can remember all those things. Can you remember how much you had to have it? Yes, they can remember all that stuff. And then I'll say to them, do you remember what you paid for it? And they will struggle with that question. They will know contextually around what number, and they'll say a number to me. And in at least half a dozen cases out of 10, they're incorrect in what they paid for it. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. Now, we as estate agents think the price is so important in the equation, yet I have property sellers who are casting their mind back to the time that they bought the very property that I'm looking to list right now, and they can't remember what they paid for it. Can you understand how important this is? Because what I know is that buyers want a home, and they want the best home that they can get for the money they have, or the money they're able to secure to go ahead and buy that home. And that's where I focus my energy. They want a home. If you allow price to become the issue, then it becomes the issue. But if you allow their feelings to come to the service and the focus on the home, then that's the way it works. Sellers, similarly, I understand this beyond any reproach whatsoever, that sellers are selling for a motive. They want to fulfill a motive. If I allow the focus to rest on price, that will become a problem. But if I continually drive the focal point, if I make it centric to the motive they're trying to fulfill, then the whole price issue becomes pliable. It allows me the opening to remove myself from the blame around price and spend most of my dialogue around fulfilling the motive. And as long as the price that we obtain allows the fulfillment of that motive, the pressure will be eased up. I honestly believe that most of the time they're just trying to protect themselves because they believe that someone might try and dupe them in this area. So I say, where's the value in a CMA, really? Why on earth would you want to enter into a subjective argument on price? So in practice, when I'm at a listing presentation, I make the seller aware of the fact that I have a CMA. If I'm the second or third agent in, they will typically already have one. I will tell them that I have one in the bag and I'm more than happy to leave it with them. But what I openly articulate to them is I'm going to leave it in the bag if that's okay with you, because I don't want that to adversely affect my idea of where we could take the property. You see, my job in the first instance is to protect the value of the property, to make sure that each buyer that comes to it parts with their maximum, that they won't, I don't want to devalue the property where they're seeing less value in it. And how I see that can be influenced by that comparative market analysis. So I just want to leave it in the bag if that's okay. And in any event, it's just a history lesson. To my mind, it's about creating value. It's about maximizing. It's about leveraging the value beyond compare. So in the first instance, I want to protect it. In the second, I want to take every opportunity I can to leverage that value. Now it comes down to an important issue, and this is the point I want to leave you thinking on. What do you really want? Do you have an overwhelming urge to be correct on price? And let's face it, how often have you actually been correct on price? I mean, exact, precise. I can tell you that I'm rarely right. I've lost count of the number of properties that I've sold at a level that I would never part for. I can't see that value in that personally, but it's not for me to invest myself in it personally. I say this all the time, don't buy into the emotion. It affects your judgment. So I've sold properties well beyond what I thought was reasonable. And I don't get hung up on it because I look at it and I say the seller's got the home they want. So the buyer has got the home they want and the seller has fulfilled their motive. Similarly, I've sold properties below what I thought is reasonable. And whilst it's felt awkward, I've still had a situation where the seller has fulfilled their motive, and surely that's the most important part. I do get pretty passionate about this, but I've got to say this and understand it. What property owners want is advice, not price. In your professional capacity, they want you to explain how it is you protect and leverage value. They need to have it explained to them, the difference between comparative value, which is largely subjective, and market value, which is what they actually receive, and that's what is derived. And they need to see your professional capacity in controlling and enhancing that through the value variables that you have total control over. Don't buy into it. And I've said this, I say this over and over again. I definitely said this on the last recording that I shared with you, and that's this. Most of the challenges in the real estate business, the answers to those, the solutions to those challenges are found in paradox. If your competitors are hung up with overquoting price, if your competitors are hung up with fixating on assurances around value, why don't you just take the road less traveled? Why don't you talk about exploring the possibilities, put no cap on it without giving any assurances, and then you have control of the situation, make all of the context, especially as it relates to sellers, make it centric to the motive. Focus on what people are trying to do, show them how to do it, and you will be the most successful real estate salesperson in your immediate service area. My name's Mark Dwyer. You can contact me, Mark with a K, at salestrainer.com.au. My mobile phone number is +61 410 592 165. And I look forward to talking to you again next week